Demonstrations in Melbourne.
From SBS, this is World News Australia.
A Pakistani government minister has put a bounty on the head of the maker of an anti-Islam film produced in America. The Railways Minister offering $100,000 for Nakula Basili Nakula's death.
Funeral prayers today for one of those killed in Friday's demonstrations. The government had sanctioned a day of protests, but called for it to be peaceful. Instead, there was rage on the streets against the film and against the United States, which is seen by many here as the enemy. And after the mayhem and destruction, now an extraordinary statement from a government minister soliciting the murder of the filmmaker. To applause from local journalists in the city of Peshawar.
I invite our Taliban and Al-Qaeda brothers to take part in this noble cause. I will give $100,000 to whoever succeeds. If he is handed over to me, I will do it myself.
More than 1,000 demonstrators rallied in Islamabad. In Karachi, a small group of Christians joined members of the Islamist Party to denounce the movie. And more than 1,000 people demonstrated at Dortmund in Germany. Around 300 others also marched through Karlsruhe in the country's southwest. And here there have been heated arguments as Muslims and non-Muslims faced off in Melbourne. It followed violent scuffles in Sydney last week over a film mocking Islamic prophet Muhammad. SBS reporter Alan Raskall has more.
Well, after those ugly scenes in Sydney last weekend, there were protests here in Melbourne today. Earlier this week, there were calls for an Islamic rally here at the State Library, but amid fears of potential violence and a call for peace from Muslim leaders and police, the demonstration was officially cancelled. There were also plans by non-Muslims to hold a rally, further fuelling fears of unrest. Here at the State Library, there were a number of heated words exchanged.
Around the world, Muslims are protesting, and you're trying to make it, there's nothing going on.
Police were not taking any chances, though, with a larger presence here in the city, just in case things got out of hand. They were prepared for anything, desperate to avoid the violence that flared in Sydney last week over a film mocking Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. That has prompted the US Embassy here in Australia to warn American citizens that they could become targets. US consulate staff also urged to avoid drawing attention to themselves as US citizens.
SBS reporter Alan Raskall there in Melbourne.
In the news today, Sunday the 23rd of September, and despite calls for calm through the week, tensions boiled over on the steps of Melbourne State Library today. The clash erupted when a group of men in nationalist alternative T-shirts weighed in on a debate between some atheists and a Muslim couple. In Sydney, though, there was no sign of the violent scenes of last weekend.
Yeah, I got to say, though, some of the people there...
Tonight, more vocal than violent, but still ignoring police pleas for calm. Anger in Melbourne as cultural tensions bubble.
This is 10 News with Matt Doran and Natasha Rexelby.
Good evening and welcome to 10 News. A cultural clash has erupted in Melbourne, proving last week's violent riots in Sydney are far from forgotten.
Despite political and religious leaders calling for calm, this afternoon tensions boiled over on the steps of Melbourne's State Library. 10's Sarah Abo is there. Sarah, good evening to you. Who exactly was at this protest that got rather heated?
It did, Tash, that's correct, and there were about 3 different groups that caused that heated discussion here. Despite the cancellations earlier this week, we saw a small group of atheists, a small group of Muslims and a nationalist-type group. Now, they were, of course, all met by a rather large police contingent who were on hand to ensure there was none of that violence we saw in Sydney repeated here in Melbourne. Now, the altercation itself was really just a verbal stoush. It was quite tense, although there was no violence. At one point, police did step in just to ensure everyone's safety. Here are some of the words exchanged, as well as the police reaction.
Like, you're threatening me, a female, you're threatening me, you're threatening me.
Around the world, Muslims are protesting, and you're trying to make it, there's nothing going on.
We did speak to some people who we thought had potential to be antagonistic, so we just advised them that everybody's got a right to be there.
So overall, there were about 40 police officers on scene, as we've just heard. They did speak to a couple of people involved in this protest. Fortunately, no arrests were made, and altogether the protest was over within a couple of hours.
Sarah Arbo in Melbourne, thank you.
Sydney-siders made it through the weekend without even a hint of the violent riots that erupted last Saturday. An additional 300 officers were brought in to patrol the city as part of an Operation Waterman.
In the end, police do not restore calm to a community alone. It is the community itself. We saw great support from Islamic leadership.
Police say they'll continue to monitor social media for any early signs of unrest.
Tempers flare as protesters clash in the city. A couple escapes a horrific... Kenzie, thank you. Well, heated scenes on the steps of the State Library this afternoon in the wake of a cancelled Islamic protest. Members of a nationalist group faced off with Muslims amid a large police presence. Brendan Roberts has this story.
There were eyes in the sky, dozens on the ground and some on horseback. Sydney's experience guiding Melbourne's response. But on the steps of the State Library, this was a gathering of nationalists staging their own protest against the Muslim protesters who, true to their word, never arrived. There was heated debate.
There was trouble from Muslims in Sydney, and now they're expecting the same sort of thing from the same sort of angry Muslims in Melbourne, so that's why the police are here.
We believe in freedom.
The police here for people like you.
But it never descended into violence.
Something which this video should be doing is give an opportunity for dialogue.
Every discussion, though, seemed to end with... The atheists arrived holding provocative signs.
Equally fair to all religions, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, a factual statement.
With nationalists on one side, atheists on the other, with chaos and violence.
And in Nigeria, tens of thousands marched in the city of Kano, burning American flags and images of President Barack Obama. The Libyan government has banned armed militias like the ones suspected of killing 4 Americans, including the ambassador in Benghazi, on the first day of the protests against the film. On the campaign trail in Wisconsin, the US president was talking tough.
As we saw last week, we've still got threats out there. We saw the attack on our consulate, and we will bring those murderers to justice. And that's why, as long as I am Commander-in-Chief, we will sustain the strongest military the world has ever known.
But it's the people of Libya already taking action, forcing militia groups to flee their strongholds. Michael Troy, ABC News.
In Melbourne, white pride groups have vastly outnumbered Muslims at peaceful protests in the city's CBD. Earlier this week, Islamic leaders called off a planned demonstration against the Innocence of Muslims online video after learning other groups plan to hijack the protest. Today, members of the anti-immigration nationalist alternative group chanted slogans. There were several heated discussions between Muslims and atheists. One man was escorted from an argument by about 40 police. In Sydney, a heavy police presence ensured there was no repeat of last weekend's violence.